We are going to shift into a new section on the scars of our story. And this is a part of the journey in the book that Mia had to go through, but more than that, it's a part of the journey that we all go through. And I want to try to bring some understanding and some light to the areas of our life that have been opposed, because that affects how we interpret who we are, how we process who God is, and how we step into our dreams and gifting or don't. So we're going to go into that section right now. First, let's talk about the scars of our story. And what I mean by that is the areas in your life, some of the scars will be visible, but most of the time they're not. They're not anything that we could see when we talk to you or when we're hanging out with you, but nonetheless, they cut deep. And by the scars, it's maybe a word that was withheld when you were younger that initiated it. Maybe it was something said about you or against you that cut deep from a parent or a good friend or a coach or a teacher, a young boyfriend or girlfriend, a cousin, an uncle. It could be multiple sources, but none of us get through life without scars. And so when we talk about the scars of your story, it's important to remember, though God didn't cause them, He can redeem them. And that's His desire, is to redeem our scars. And so when you think about the scars, early on, John Eldredge has made this point that the enemy tries to wound us in the areas that he knows will be our greatest strength, because he fears who we could be. And so a really fascinating study on this that you can do is think back to your childhood. Think back to the things that wounded you the most, that caused the deepest cuts. And now look at your life, where you are and what God's inviting you into. And oftentimes you can go back and see where the strategic strike was aimed at really who you were meant to become. And it was the enemy trying to cut you from the knees, kill, steal, and destroy as best he could when you were the most defenseless, when you were the youngest. And so that's what we mean by the scars of your story. The strikes are strategic. They do attack at our point of purpose. What your calling or gifting is, anything that can be done to have taken you out has been done. And that's why a lot of people have some pretty deep scars. I want to look not just back to your scars when you were younger, but I want to take us back even further to get into what's really going on. The universe, was breathed into existence by God. Life happened through God, and it was a universe of width. We talked about that some last night. But what we didn't talk about last night so much was the rebellion in heaven. And Scripture talks about how a third of the created angels, angelic beings, 1 out of 3 rebelled under Lucifer's charge against God. So think about this for a minute. It's a story we've heard, but 1 out of 3. So if you're a creator of a story, imagine 1 out of 3 of the characters not only don't want to be in the story, but they actively try to slit your throat at night when you go to bed. 1 out of 3 created beings you created now who can see you face to face. And it's really an incredible, it's an unfathomable thing to even think about, because angelic beings who could see God face to face, 1 out of 3 somehow chose this over God, chose the enemy, Lucifer, over God. So the rebellion happens in heaven. We know the end of the story. We know God, of course, is successful at throwing them out of heaven after the battle. But just stop for a minute and think, how would God's heart feel in that situation? How would it feel if a third of your children tried to kill you? Not just tried to leave, tried to kill you. not just tried to do something different, tried to take you out. A third of the beings God created who were with him turned against him. What would that do to his heart? That's part of the intimacy with God, is wondering, asking. Yes, I know how the story went from what Scripture says, but God, how did you feel when that happened? What did that do to your heart? And basically, the rebellion in heaven, it was against the concept of with. It was absolutely a strike at intimacy and identity with God. So the enemy is a created being who rebels against his creator. A lot of people would say he was one of the most, at the time, before he rebelled and fell, one of the most beautiful angelic beings. He obviously could sway 1 out of 3 of the fallen angels who chose him over God. So something was going on there that's almost beyond imagination. But notice, he's a created being still. And in his defeat, Satan loses everything. He lost his identity that he had, the responsibilities he had. He lost intimacy with God. And he lost the ability to co-create or bring life to anything. I think one of the reasons the enemy hates women so much is because they bring life into the world. So you're a created being. We're talking about co-creating with God. God creates us as sons and daughters. We get to co-create with him. He was created by God, co-creates with him, and then he falls. So now he no longer can create with God. Now he no longer can bring life out of nothingness. And I think that's why he hates our creative fellowship with God. I think besides it bringing intimacy, he is not a creative being. He's a created being, and all he can really bring is chaos and disorder and disruption to God's creation. But he is not, I don't believe, a creative force. I believe he's a chaotic force, a disruptive force against life and against creation. He chose the wrong story, and he's been trying to make us choose that wrong story ever since. So remember the goal, right? In John 10, 6 through 10, is for him to kill, steal, and destroy. And he does that by offering us anything without God. And now it's really interesting to go back through Scripture and just do a quick look, because his strategy is not very creative. He's not very creative. He's persistent. He has learned over the ages, I think, what works, but he offers anything without God. So let's just go through some things in the Bible. Eve, rather than God and intimacy of walking with him in the garden, she chooses a forbidden fruit. Adam, in that moment, could still choose God, but he chooses Eve. Both of them make a move without God. Now let's go to some of the New Testament stories. The prodigal son, he's right there in the story with his father, and he chooses pleasure over intimacy, over being with his father. The older son stays, but he doesn't choose the father, he chooses duty. And God, in the parable, the God figure, the father, offers him something far more valuable. He says, you can have me, but neither one chose that. Both sons sought inheritance without relationship. One wanted the inheritance for pleasure. One wanted it for what it would take if he stayed. The money he would get is the literal inheritance. But neither really wanted intimacy with the Father. Let's look at Martha. She's there with Jesus, and she chooses productivity over time with him. The rich young ruler, right there face to face with Jesus, holds on to possessions instead of Jesus. Why am I showing you these? I'm showing you these because we continue to make choices in our life that feels very logical for where we are, or very tempting for where we are. And in all those cases, all we're doing is we're choosing something over God, something over our intimacy with God. All of these people that you just saw, they all believed in God They even were with Jesus face to face in many cases. And they chose without. They chose something else that left them without that intimacy with God or over God. And we do the same today. So think about today, what are some things that we will get distracted in and choose to pursue that takes away our intimacy with God, or that we choose as kind of a substitute in what we're in pursuit of, that we give our heart to? What would some of those things be in our world today? Television. Okay. Job. Money. Power. Sports. Our children sometimes, yeah. What'd you say? Family. The enemy doesn't really care what we pick. He just wants us to choose, in essence, to make a move without God. Here's God, but this is really, I can't give this up right now. And we don't literally think we're replacing God with it. It just consumes our attention. It consumes our mind. And so, in essence, it takes us down a path where ultimately we find ourselves alone and in isolation. Into this world of without, though, comes Jesus. And I love how the name he's given is Emmanuel, God with us. Like, it's a story of redemption and of this battle between with and without. A war against God, without God, to with God. From orphan into freedom. The book talks a lot about the art of kintsugi. The cover is a bottle, glass bottle with kintsugi. The gold on the bottle, if you've read the story, you're familiar with what it is. But kintsugi was just this fascinating process from ancient Japan that caused me really to change the whole flow of the book once I was writing it. And it's a Japanese art form from the 15th century. And basically, what they do is when pottery or anything glass or fragile breaks, if they can repair it, rather than throw it away, they'll infuse it with this liquid gold and make it whole again. In America, when something breaks, we're pretty quick to just trash it, get something new. Everything's disposable. If something breaks, we buy a new dish, we buy a new cup. But then, this art form was able not only to save things, but actually make the broken beautiful again. Here's an image of kintsugi on a cup. It actually is a more beautiful cup with it than without it. And what history would say is when these things happened and people would repair a piece of pottery that way, that would be the one they gave to the most respected guest that came to their house. Because now it wasn't just something with a Band-Aid on it or broken, but it was the most original piece they had. And it glistened with gold. Kintsugi was a way to make something not only better, but better than it was. And when I first was reading about it, I was like, right, but it just highlights the broken areas. Like, it's the very part you don't want somebody to see. If we were gluing something, you wouldn't want somebody to see where it had broken. You would hope it would be seamless and be hidden from the eye. But this does just the opposite. But rather than hide the imperfections, the shimmering gold illuminates them, and it actually honors the history of the item by acknowledging it matters. And the scars in our story, God is actually saying, I will redeem those scars, but I'm going to use those scars too. I'm going to use your broken places in ways that doesn't just hide it, but that actually redeems it, that actually makes that more a source of your strength. If the enemy was trying to take you out in this area, I will redeem it in ways beyond what it was before. And so, just like kintsugi makes something more valuable, a one-of-a-kind piece, Jesus came with that same mission. Like, you're all familiar when Jesus was asked, why are you here? What is your purpose? What is your mission? What he said was, he quoted Isaiah. And he said, I've come to heal the shattered hearted, the broken hearted, the fractured hearted, and to set the captives free. That's the two reasons he came. He didn't come so we'd get our act together. He didn't come because he just really was ticked off and wanted us to somehow figure it out. He didn't come to be the morality police. He came to heal our shattered heart and set us free. He puts the fragments of our lives back together with his healing light, and then we get to be infused with that, and we get to take that, our healed scars, and now go out in the world and use that as a source of strength. When I was a publisher, one of the authors who was extremely successful had a very tragic childhood and was abused as a girl. And she was writing novels, and so this wasn't her autobiography, but in every novel, she would take examples and stories of the pain that she had gone through, fictionalize it, and reach women with stories of healing in those areas. She was able to take the source of her wounding and turn it into a source of her strength. Rather than hide it and pretend it didn't exist, she was actually able, with God's healing, to step into that with a strength. In the dreams that you have and the things that you love to do, think back to where those were opposed. Think back to events or words, situations that would have caused you to never want to really believe you could do what you most love to do. And oftentimes that is in childhood, but it doesn't have to be. But now we can take that as part of our story, as part of re-seeing our story in a new way, rather than hide or cloak or avoid. We can actually say, God's healed us with his kintsugi. He's actually put this back together in a way that brings a source of strength. And in the book, that's what, Ryder is one of my favorite characters, and Ryder and Mia talk a lot about kintsugi in the desert and about her own scars and how that can be turned and actually be used as a source that brings her strength and life and allows her creativity to flow to others. And ultimately give it more of an eternal glow. Like, think of your creativity laced with kintsugi. Think of your dreams and your desires and your fractured places now put back together by God with this gold. And now you go forward. Now you go forward with that as a strength. That's what I mean by kintsugi creativity. It doesn't make things, when it's God, almost as good as new, but better than new with his touch. And what that does is it ushers us into unexpected beauty, into us and our gifting. Our scars really can be a source of our strength. And so the question is, what is your unique scars that you had? I'm not asking you to say this out loud, but I do want you to spend some time with it in your journal and later. What are those unique scars, and how will that infuse you after God's healed them with a light, with kintsugi, to go after other parts of the world that need light? It should look different for each of us. Now, this next part I want to talk to you about is really fresh and new, way after I wrote the story of With. About 10 weeks ago, I started doing a look into chaos, because I realized, man, no matter how well I'm trying to walk with God, there is chaos every day in life that we face. So how do we walk through that? Or do we not walk through it? Or do we avoid it? Or what is our response? How do we handle the chaos in our lives? And by chaos, I'll have a definition up here of what I'm talking about, but it's probably something I don't even need to explain to you. We live in a world that's filled with chaos. And our real choice is this: whether we use chaos or chaos uses us. The choice isn't whether we face chaos, but It's what do we do with it? The dictionary defines chaos, and what I'm talking about here is a state of utter confusion or disorder, a total lack of organization or order. Or maybe your last Wednesday, or every day last week. Like, it's just this feeling that there's confusion, disorder, there's the next thing that's coming at us. So think about the chaos you're facing at this moment. Like right now, what is it? And I'm not asking you to say it out loud, but each person probably has 5 or 6 things. And some of them may not feel epic. It may be my credit card was stolen, or it may be a situation with a child, or it may be a situation with finances, or it may be a job situation or a health situation. But think about the chaos you're facing at this moment. Most people have these kind of responses to chaos. They tend to run from it. They tend to wait it out, worry about it, or try to control it. Can you guys relate to those 4? I was at a conference on creativity recently, and a writer was there, and we had this long conversation, and basically she was saying, I really have this book I want to write, but my life is so chaotic, I just can't even think about it or start it till the chaos passes. Her approach in that moment was, I'm going to wait it out. I can't even think about what I was really put on this earth to try to breathe life into and do. I'm just going to have to wait till the chaos passes. So here's a question for your journal. How does chaos affect your presence and your creativity? Remember, part of our creativity is our presence. We're transforming the atmosphere by bringing something new into existence through who we are. That's how God created. That's how we co-create with God. So how does chaos affect your presence? Does your presence change when things in life get chaotic? Are you a different person when everything hits the fan? And how does that affect your pursuit of what you feel like you are here to do? A deeper question is, how does it affect your heart? What does chaos do to your heart? Most of the time, it freezes or shuts our heart down or causes us to just go numb or flatline, feel overwhelmed. See, our calling, though, as a son or daughter is different when we face chaos. It's not to do the things we listed on the board earlier, wait it out, fear it, shut down, run away. But chaos will derail us. So what I started doing was looking at Scripture. And what I wanted to find out is, how did God approach chaos? Because after all, if He's my dad, I can probably learn a lot from Him on that. And how did Jesus step into chaos? Because there was chaos all around Him. Now, this was the dictionary definition I gave you earlier, but it also offers one other definition of chaos. And I like this other one. It says the infinity of space or formless matter supposed to have preceded the existence of the ordered universe. That's interesting. That's in the dictionary. That's not an academic or a Bible study. That's in the dictionary. Chaos is the infinity of space or formless matter supposed to have preceded the existence of the ordered universe. Well, this feels a little bit more like Genesis 1 when we're going into it. Chaos comes from a Greek word spelled K-H-A-O-S, originally, chaos, and it meant the primeval emptiness of the universe. Now, here's where it starts to get very interesting. Genesis 1:2 says the earth, this is one translation, was a soup of nothingness, a bottomless emptiness, an inky blackness. Between Genesis 1:1 in the beginning and Genesis 1:3, when God created, there's this verse in Genesis 1:2 sandwiched between that is fascinating, puzzling, wild. So it talks about in the beginning was the heavens and the earth, and then it says, and the earth was a soup of nothingness, a bottomless emptiness, and God's Spirit hovered over the abyss. Another translation says, the rushing Spirit of God hovered over the face of the ocean. Well, God hasn't created the ocean yet. There's not night or day yet. And yet something's going on in Genesis 1:2. And the Spirit of God is involved with it. So how does God respond to that chaos in Genesis 1:2? My thought was, if I can learn from him, that's a great starting place. In the beginning, there's some kind of chaos. And Hebrew scholars have said they believe that in Genesis 1:2 it's saying more than create from nothingness, although he could have, God creates order from chaos. God brings order and beauty and life from chaos. When we get to Genesis 1:3, it starts talking about how, and there's a pattern that keeps repeating. God spoke, he saw, it was good. In Genesis 1:3, it's about light. He spoke light, he speaks it, he sees that it's good, he separates light from darkness, and he names it. And this is kind of a pattern that goes through several of the creation days. He speaks something, he sees that it's good, he names it, he separates it. But it started back in Genesis 1:2 when he brought order out of chaos. So how does chaos affect his creativity? It's like God will take chaos and then he brings order out of it. He creates order out of it. And so as I started thinking about that, I thought, okay, well, in our lives, how can we face chaos in a new way? If our creativity transforms the atmosphere, if our creativity is based on our presence and our gifting, maybe we can walk into the chaos of our life, and instead of running or instead of waiting or cowering, what if we can actually transform it? Now, bringing order out of chaos, let me start with what I don't mean by order. Order is not control. For us, I don't believe, but it's restoration. I think we've been put on this earth to restore order and beauty in life as we co-create with God. As we bring our gifting and our dreams into this world with God, I think we can actually step into the chaotic moments of our life, and it changes sometimes just by walking into the room. If you have a family gathering and there's chaos there, and you walk into the room with your presence, you can actually start to change that chaos and atmosphere, I believe, sometimes without saying a word. Because you have the presence of God with you. Whether they know exactly what's going on or not, you're stepping into chaos and you're changing something by your presence. You don't have to, if you're an artist, you don't have to bring a piece of art in the room and go, look, 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 look. And now let this change the world. You can walk in yourself and say, maybe not next to nothing, but bring love and peace into chaos and fear. You can restore what was meant to be. One definition of restore is just simply to bring back into existence, restore. You can bring back into existence something that should be there, that God desires, that the world was created for. When we think about Jesus, how did Jesus live with chaos? And when I first started looking into this, I thought, well, maybe I can find a story or two. Well, actually, it's every story with Jesus throughout the whole Bible was Jesus either healing or bringing order or bringing life, but somehow stepping into chaos again and again and again. Sometimes it was the sea, sometimes it was a person, but he would step into chaos and he would always bring life and order. So it was really like more of a question of which one do I pick to talk about? And even when Jesus talked about his parables, I love in Matthew 13 how it says, that's why I tell stories, to create readiness, to nudge people toward receptive insight. In other words, I tell stories to create. We're talking a lot about creativity. He's saying, I speak words and stories and I create and change the atmosphere with people by bringing something new to them, help them see differently. In Matthew 13 later it says, I will open my mouth and tell stories. I will bring out into the open things hidden since the world's first days. Well, how cool is that? God has hidden things since creation. In God's creativity and creation, he hides things for his sons and daughters to find through their creativity, through their stories, through their art, through their gifting, through their dreams that have been hidden since Eden. What is it that is hidden that you're going to find? What is your creativity going to bring out into the open because of who you are? What is your life going to bring out that's been hidden? I love how Jesus describes it. Then there's the story of Peter. So when Peter stepped out of the boat, and I used to think that Jesus asked Peter to step out of the boat. But then lately, as I was rereading it, I was like, no, Peter's the one who said, he initiated it. He said, I want to come out on the water with you. And Jesus says, all right, come. But then when Peter looks down, he's stepping on the water, he's walking on water for a second. But when he looks down at the waves churning beneath his feet, he lost his nerve and he started to sink. In other words, another way I would say it is when Peter looked down and saw chaos beneath him, he got nervous and he sunk. He was toast at that moment. He saw chaos and he feared it. And Jesus responded to him, faint heart, what got into you? He didn't demean him. I think it was probably a tender comment, but it was, your heart has fear, your heart is nervous. What got into you? It's not you. What did you let get into you? What fear got into you because of the chaos? Because before the fear, he was walking on top of the water. So here's a big thought. Order is not what we need to wait for before we can create, before we can step into what we are here for, but actually part of what we are invited to bring into being. We don't need to wait for order to come in our lives or things to finally calm down. We're actually called to be part of that order and that calm, to usher it in to our part of the world, to our home, to the people that work around us, to our children. And so I want to say this to you because when chaos starts to nip at your heels, and it will, and it is, and it has, it's a beautiful thought to say, I can actually walk into the chaos, whatever's going on. I'm not asking for it. I'm not wanting it, but I can walk into it when it does come with God, and I can actually bring order and beauty and life from chaos. That's what God did in Genesis 1:2. That's what Jesus did in every story that we see of him. Literally every story, he is transforming the atmosphere around him, sometimes through physical touch, healing, sometimes through stories that reveal what's been hidden since the beginning of the world, sometimes through control of the weather, the storms. Sometimes a crowd's walking at him and he just walks straight through the crowd. Like they can't even stop him, touch him. He just goes straight through them. That's what I want our force to be when chaos comes. That's what I want our strength to be is, it's chaotic. And part of my calling, part of my power, part of my strength is to bring order from the chaos. So I'm not going to run from it. I'm not going to hide. I'm not going to be paralyzed by it. We're not going to hunker down and hope that it somehow just goes away. We're going to actually step into it and bring order and life in our unique way, in our unique gifting. Chaos theory is a theory applied in various branches of science that seemingly random phenomena have underlying order. This hints at a lot of what we're talking about. There's order waiting within the chaos, and we get to bring it into being. So how, if we want to look at it as God's chaos theory, how can God's chaos theory change how we create? And I believe it's an invitation to bring order from chaos by changing the atmosphere with Him. So you walk into a situation at home, everybody's panicked. You can either fuel the chaos, be paralyzed by it, or as a son or daughter of God, you can walk into it and you can actually bring order and calm and beauty and life. Doesn't mean everything's going to work out perfectly, but you're transforming the atmosphere around everybody else in a way that only can happen with God. Remember, it's your presence that changes the atmosphere. It's not what you do as much as who you are and whose you are. Now, I'm going to shift here just a slight bit and just tell you, whatever it is that you are pursuing and creating, whatever it is that you love to do, when we create in our own strength, unfortunately, it carries our weaknesses. That's the bad news part of it, okay? But what we co-create with God has the spark of eternity. When I was telling you earlier, the enemy isn't creative, can't create. The enemy basically has tried to kill the source of creativity, the creator. So I believe he's lost his access to creativity. We tap into that. When we co-create with God, what we do has an eternal impact. What we create in our own strength is somewhat forgettable over time. But with God, what we do changes the atmosphere. It ushers us first into a place of greater intimacy with God. And then the cool thing is, once we're in that place with God as we create, then when others experience what we have done, they get a taste of that too. Does that make sense? So I was talking to a friend I just met here right at the lunch break, and he was asking me about the story of With. And I said, that's the first thing I've ever created as a source of story and creativity where I feel like I really walked well with God the whole 3-year time in the creation of the book. Like I wasn't striving, I wasn't doing it for ego, I really was hungering for God, and God was coming through and waking me up at 2 and 3 in the morning. And if I knew it was Him, I'd get up and we'd go on the playground of creativity and write, even though I would rather sleep. All of a sudden, I didn't want to sleep. I wanted to create. When you create something with God, it ushers you into this place of intimacy, but then others who read it, hopefully, get a taste of that because it transcends us in the moment it was created. It has an eternal spark because we're creating with the Creator. And everybody then who tastes it later, like a meal, like a feast, gets a piece of that creative fellowship. But this is key, guys. There has to be a change in us when we're facing chaos or when we're trying to bring our dreams to life. We can't change the atmosphere if there's not a change in us first. If God doesn't change our hearts first, us first, then we have no ability on our own. You know, if we're looking at chaos and just picture it as, you know, here comes chaos, and here we are right here. If we try to enter into that with our own strength or our own wisdom, we're going to kind of, be sucked up into it and add to the chaos. But I believe if we walk into it in our identity and walk into it with God, all of a sudden we're changing the chaos. It's looking different. It's clearing up. We're seeing a purpose in that. It may be a person, maybe there's a crisis and we're at the hospital, and the crisis of the person who had to go to the hospital doesn't change, but all of a sudden something at the hospital changes. When Kelly was having a minor thing recently, we were in the hospital, and the nurse came while she was sleeping one day and said, since your wife has been here, the atmosphere in this room has changed. Like the whole floor is chaotic, but this room feels peaceful, like something's different here. I don't know if I ever told you that. I thought I'd wait till we were all together. Guess that's okay. That's right. But it changed the atmosphere by her presence, even when she was asleep. So what I'm saying is, when you walk into something, you can change the atmosphere, but the change has to be in us first. And that's what we were talking about earlier today with the scars of your story, with your identity, with who you are. So just a question to put in your journal before we go to the next part, but what part of the atmosphere were you born to change? What part of the atmosphere will be different because of you? What chaos will be diffused because of you? The world is a different place because of your presence. The question is how? I want to give you another grid. There's different ways as we approach our new identity to see God, and it impacts how we step into what He invites us into. Now, before we knew God, and many people are here in the world, they almost see God as an enemy. They're hostile to God. They're against God. They see God as, if they believe in Him at all, they're against Him. He's an enemy. Well, but then there's a lot of people who believe in God, but He's just an absent God. He's missing. So it's not that they don't necessarily believe in God, it's just He doesn't really seem to make a difference in their life. He doesn't seem to answer prayers. He doesn't seem to show up. They don't really know Him. And so they're not opposed to Him. He's just missing and absent. The bottom ones are what I would call more the self-life. But then we get into the top row, and a lot of people who believe in God see God as more of an academic God. He's a God they study, they study Him, they want to learn and teach, but it's not an intimate or relational God. And the last one is where we're trying to get to in all of our conversations, of a father primarily. God is a creator, is a father, is intimate. Obviously, the enemy himself is down here, but he'll try to get us to go in any of these other grids he can, besides intimacy with God. And we have to keep asking ourselves, I think, on a regular basis, based on how I'm reacting, what does that mean about how I see God? Based on how I'm reacting to this crisis, based on what's going on in my world right now, based on how I'm communicating with my wife, our kids, our coworkers, how does that play out? And because if I'm seeing God as intimate, then I need to see myself differently. So I just wanted to give you that grid quickly. Tangible ways when we are facing chaos or opposition to transform that into opportunity. I wanted to give you a couple of what I feel like are some tangible things to do when you're facing opposition. Is ask God what he's up to. Ask God what's going on for his interpretation of your situation. Because a lot of times, Kelly's really helpful with me in this, but I'll be talking to her and I'll say, I just feel this way, or I feel this way, or I feel this way. And she'll be like, no, but that's how you feel, but what's going on really? Like, you feel that way, but what's really going on? Because feelings can mislead, and feelings can get us really tangled up. So ask God, what's going on here, God? Help me see it through your eyes. Help me see this story and my role in it, my place in it through your eyes. That's a way to reinterpret the story. We talked also about seeing our story in mythic terms. We're not just here to go through the motions of errands every day. We're not just here to barely get by. We're not just here to get the car washed and the grass mowed and the groceries picked up and go through it again the next day and the next day. So reinterpret, re-see your story in a mythic way. Here's a big one. Look internally rather than externally. Most situations look very different from a heart level than from an external level. And most of the time we spend is on the external. The illusion that things are good. The illusion that we have more money than we do. The illusion that in church everybody's great. Everything's going super well. But the internal is always where the action is. So when you're faced with some opposition, look internally and see what journey that God's inviting you on of the heart rather than just of the situation. Lose expectations while you remain expectant. We talked about expectancy earlier, but this is so big. Lose expectations of what should be happening in your life and open yourself up to expectancy of what God's about to do. And then this would be one I'd highlight in yellow in each of your journals if I had a highlighter and you gave me your journals. Because proclaim abundance in the face of scarcity. Do any of you have in this room, if I'm not going to ask you what, but do you have anything in your life right now that you would say feels scarce? Time, money, hope, dreams, friends. If you do, raise your hand. Okay. So in the face of that, I think, when God was in creation in Genesis 1:3, we saw one of the things he did was he spoke things into existence. We need to speak in his name. In the kingdom of God, there is no scarcity. Have you ever thought, with God, he's never had a moment where things were scarce, ever. He's never run out of milk and had to run to the grocery store. He's got everything he needs. It's abundance. So we can proclaim abundance in the face of scarcity and watch what happens when we step into promises before the promises even are happening. That's made a huge difference for my heart, is to go, yep, things look scarce here, and I know God has abundance, and I'm expectant for what he's going to do in whatever that area is. Friendship, finances, job, health, time. It's just a shift in the atmosphere that happens when we speak abundance, even in the face of what looks like scarcity. Psalm 66:12 says this, "We went through fire and through water, but you have brought us out to the place of abundance." Amen. Yeah, we're going to go through fire. We're going to go through water. We're going to go through hard times. And you bring us into a place of abundance. So proclaiming that before it happens, I think, is a great way to step into opportunity of what's to come. And then just remember this last. God is not bound by any past path. The way God rescued you last month, last year, the way he came through in a situation is probably not how he's going to come through the next time. If he did, it would start to be a formula, and we've talked about that. So God is constantly raising us up as sons and daughters in new ways. He constantly allows us to stay in a state of wonder and amazement because he has endless ways to rescue us, to help us, to bring us to him. So don't start thinking, yeah, but last time this happened, here's what God did, and this time he didn't do it. So I must be doing something wrong. Or somehow we blew it this time again. No, it may just be God, and probably is, God's going to solve that a different way. He's not bound by past ways. He's not trying to create a system. He's trying to create sonship and daughterhood.